hiring excellence, I think that is referring to like every human being in your organization being like fully tapped into and like their talent being fully realized.
Welcome to Offer Accepted, the podcast that elevates your recruiting game. Your host, Shannon Ogborn, interviews top talent acquisition leaders, uncovering their secrets to building and leading successful recruiting teams. Gain valuable insights and actionable advice from analyzing cutting-edge metrics to claiming your seat at the table. Let's get started.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Offer Accepted. I'm your host, Shannon Ogborn, and this episode is brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting solution for modern talent teams. I am here today with our guest, Jhillika Kumar, CEO and founder of Mentra, who is building the world's largest neurodiversity employment network. She was recently recognized on Forbes 30 Under 30 as a recipient in the social impact category for her work at Mentra. Jhillika, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here, Shannon. And the Ashby team.
Amazing. Let's just quickly give our audience some background on yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about your role at Mentra and the organization's overall mission?
Yes, absolutely. So CEO and co-founder at Mentra, I guess a quick overview of our mission. We are building the next LinkedIn for the neurodiverse population. So really building a hiring platform for those who think differently with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, learning differences, and various forms of neurocognitive abilities to be able to serve as sort of this translation layer between the neurodivergent population and employers, or as we like to call it, the workforce of the future.
Absolutely. And I know that this is really personal for you. Can you tell us a little bit about the background story here as to why you decided to start Mentra?
Totally. So my brother, Vikram, he is 7 years older than me, and he's a non-speaking autistic individual. And growing up most of my life, I was able to go to school, get an education, get a job, and then, start a company. Whereas today he's 31 years old and he has a lot of goals and dreams and aspirations. However, because of the lack of infrastructure available to support him with his, complex support needs, from a communication partner to flexible deadlines, realizing that all of that is not in place in today's workforce to accommodate someone like him who thinks differently and has so many skill sets to bring to the workplace. And so we really built Mentra with all of those support needs in mind, assuming that, every individual has their own unique strengths and their own unique value to contribute to the workforce. And if we can build a tool that sort of serves as this translation layer, understands what the employer is looking for and what the, talent the individual can bring, how can we make that match to be as fruitful as possible and as fulfilling as possible for the job seeker as well as the recruiter hiring the individual. So that's sort of where it stemmed from. And of course, there's a lot of work that has to be done with, the corporate sort of, hiring system and structures that exist today. But we have seen a lot of movement towards companies on their roadmap and journey towards neuroinclusion that we're here to empower, augment, and really help support and spearhead into, this new workforce that is neuroinclusive.
I love that. What have some of the challenges been? So it sounds like there's a lot of companies who are getting on board, which is awesome. What have some of the challenges been, and what has the response been so far to Mentra as a product from both a user and a company perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, a population that is 80% under and unemployed. And so a lot of the challenge with this population is how can we look at those non-traditional measures of talent, because a population that might not have had previous work experience or might not have a linear path to education, there's so much more that we have to look for and evaluate when assessing talent. So, trying to understand how can we look beyond work experience, education? Can we go into past projects? Can we go into work samples? Can we look at certifications or boot camps that the individual went through? Can we look at college courses that they took that map to specific, areas of, growth and expertise for the job seeker? So really trying to evaluate those factors. And it's interesting because a lot of the systems out there today and tools sort of look at, those factors as inbuilt parameters. And so how can we sort of expand our scope of thinking to look at folks with those nonlinear paths and match them with meaningful careers? So I would say that's been a challenge. And especially with the advent of hybrid and remote work for this population, it's been hugely made the workforce so much more accessible. But then trying to map that with, providing individuals if they do end up moving to work hybrid or in person, how do we set them up with a support system in their new environment? How can we really make sure they are, understanding instructions from their managers and that communication is transparent? So there's challenges associated with both the screening process as well as once the individual is hired, how do they make sure there's long-term retention and success and support, and then career development eventually into ideally leadership, positions and even individual contributor positions to really succeed in the role. So yeah, challenges throughout, but we're learning and overcoming and growing stronger as a community as we learn about ourselves.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of dismantling the system and putting and encouraging new norms in place so that hiring and companies thinking about hiring and retaining talent are also considering how to be neuroinclusive.
100%.
Great. So before we jump into the how, because I know we're going to talk a little bit about how would a company go about being neuroinclusive in their hiring, let's just take a step back and talk about why. Why should companies invest in neuroinclusive hiring practices?
Yeah, that is a great question. And as we look at the stats, 1 in every 7 human beings worldwide are neurodivergent. That's an estimated 1.1 billion, people in the world that are under and unemployed by 80%. However, that 80% is not due to a lack of skills or ability. It's due to, the systems in place that aren't designed to be cognitively accessible for this population. So when brought into the right environments, studies show that neurodivergents are actually 30% more productive than the average employee. And there's also a 50% less turnover rate for the community. So that is really, a huge benefit for retention, for increased productivity, for increased bottom line. And there's just so many advantages of thinking differently. I mean, if you think about it, the greatest innovators of our day, from, Steve Jobs to, Alan Turing to Albert Einstein to Greta Thunberg, all are neurodivergent. And you can just, see by demonstration when having the right supports in place, neurodivergence can really demonstrate increased innovation, agility, problem-solving ability, and just improve the company culture because, differences in thinking are being accommodated and we're empathizing with the way that someone else perceives the world. We're able to walk in the shoes of another individual and really understand, how to provide the accommodations that will allow someone to succeed. So it's really, creating not just a better work environment that's understanding of everyone, it's also increasing bottom line demonstrated through, increased productivity and retention. So it really does solve that $1 trillion turnover problem, which in large part is caused to, challenges, especially for mental health challenges in the workplace. And we see that by accommodating, a neurodivergent individual, by providing breaks, by being understanding and providing the individual the environment and social interpersonal environment to succeed, it just makes the workforce more inclusive for everyone. So yeah, a whole lot of benefits, and companies like the Microsofts, the JP Morgans, the Ernst & Youngs of the world are realizing this, and they're starting to tap into it at scale.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned a couple of things that I think are strong business arguments on top of the ethical argument that everybody deserves to have a place where they belong, where they're valued, where they can do their best work. But what have you found is the best way for those who are already bought into this concept of neuroinclusive hiring? How do they communicate to those who really aren't quite there yet? Or what advice would you give someone who is trying to get a colleague or a leader up to speed on neuroinclusive hiring?
Yeah, I think there's so many ways to do this, and we've seen this across different companies operate through different models, some of which are, grassroots, where neurodivergent employees within an organization come together in the form of an employee resource group or a cost champion team and start to create forums. So to start to talk with other neurodivergents, understand, what are the challenges our teammates are facing? How are they getting access to the accommodations that they need? Do they have the support systems in place? Are their managers understanding of their differences? And sort of have those conversations amongst groups. So whether that's in the form of, a social forum when you can go and type with others, or, calls where you just, meet one-on-one or in group settings, those have been ways to sort of spark the conversation and make folks realize, well, I'm not alone in this and I can talk to others and we can come together and, have our voices heard. So that's been really powerful. And we've seen that in a lot of, the Fortune 500 companies where ERGs have been formed, and then you bring in executive leadership to then come in and, sponsor the group to then have either, sometimes it falls under the disability advocacy networks, or sometimes they happen to be their own neurodiversity focused networks, which can even include, caregivers of neurodivergent individuals, neurodivergents themselves. So that's been, a really powerful way to really mobilize internal employees to, cause change across the organization. The second one that I think has been a powerful sort of call to action to again spark this movement is when executive, leaders across the organization, they get vulnerable and they come out and they tell, individuals, well, I have this life experience. I learned recently I'm neurodivergent myself, and share that life experience. Or, I might be the father or a sister or, a family member of a neurodivergent individual. And it really touches me deeply. And, I want to make this change in the world to make my company more neuroinclusive. So coming out about those stories, being vulnerable about it, especially from executive leadership, really allows for neurodivergents to no longer hide, to no longer mask, and realize that, well, if my, leadership is sharing their challenges and also the strengths associated with their neurodivergence, well, I can too. And maybe that is what makes our organization special and innovative. So those have been some really, powerful movements we see ripple across organizations that has led to, wide scale change in large companies as well as small businesses and startups as well.
For sure. I had the personal pleasure of being a global lead on the Disability Alliance when I was at Google. And it was both an enlightening experience, a very positive experience, but also sometimes you just heard of these stories of managers not being supportive, of just certain circumstances where you just wish that there was more awareness around how to support people. And I think one thing, and I don't know how you feel about this, but Google had so many amazing efforts come from grassroots efforts from the ERGs, which I always found to be super inspiring and amazing. But I don't know about you. I wish that the onus didn't have to be on neurodivergent folks or people with disabilities to have to create that awareness. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's definitely something that, a lot of times we hear folks say, well, you need to have neurodivergence in leadership positions in order to make that kind of change. And I think, sometimes there is a sense of, in-group versus out-group bias that emerges when, you have, neurodivergence and non-neurodivergence potentially. I think that by hearing from the lived experiences of neurodivergent individuals, only then can we really understand what needs to change. So I think having those voices, heard throughout the process is important. But I don't think that the onus should be left just for the neurodivergent individual to change this entire system. I think it takes every single one of us going through a mindset shift in an organization. And I think that's sort of the principle of universal design, is that if you build something, that's accessible for one, subsection of the population, it makes life better and easier and more accessible for everyone. And the same goes with, if we understand how individuals with, very complex support needs or experiencing, very complex challenges can be accommodated, then, can we all learn about how to play our part together? And that's where training comes in. That's where education and change management comes in, as well as, sort of a systems and technology change comes in too, with using tools and products that can really cater to all and be inclusive of all.
Yeah, awareness is such a big part of this. Without the stories and without the personal lived experience being shared, it is hard to put yourself in the shoes of that person. But like you said, we could do better of all working together. Each and every person is responsible for dismantling this system, not just people who have that lived experience.
Yeah. We're all, whether it's now or in the future or with our families, like we are all going to experience, different thinking, and we are going to be touched by, challenges and even potentially limitations and even disabilities, especially as we grow older and the aging population. Like, we're building something that's not just going to be helpful for us or our kids. It's just going to ripple across and help, future generations. And that is, 1 in every 7 humans. So it's sort of a large group of the population that we're empowering by making a cultural shift.
100%. Amazing. So let's start getting into the how. So I know that your all's platform is, like you said, sort of like a LinkedIn hosting neurodivergent folks. Is that what companies mostly use to find pools of neurodiverse talent, or how else would companies find neurodiverse pools of talent, and where?
Neurodivergence, it's such an intersectional community. There are, so many places when we look at talent pools and how to find talent, depending on where you're hiring for. So if it's early career, entry-level jobs, there's, disability career centers in university offices. There are even, autism-specific groups on certain college campuses where neurodivergents go to seek support and employment prospects as well as they graduate. So that's, a huge pool of talent coming out of universities. The other, if you look at a lot of non-traditional sort of upskilling providers, including boot camps or certifications, so many, especially during the pandemic, we've seen so many neurodivergents that wanted to pivot in their careers, going into and participating in these, Coursera's and boot camps and really getting upskilled in, let's say, coding and UX design and data analysis, and really getting the skills needed to then enter a job in the workplace and getting those real life projects under their belt as well. So, that's it. There's a huge, so many different sort of ecosystem stakeholders that, and sort of places where these talent pools live. The goal we've tried to, harness at Mentra is really bringing together all of those ecosystem players. So we bring together the university talent, the bootcamp talent. We also work with government and voc rehab centers, which are government-funded occupational and upskilling, programs across the nation. So really trying to make the recruiter and hiring team's life easier instead of building those one-on-one relationships with different schools and different departments and organizations. Our goal is to bring, the entire community together. Another large, talent pool we've seen is advocacy networks across the country. So whether that's Annie or Autism Self-Advocacy Network or Autism Society of America, so many neurodivergents approach these different communities for, social networking, support, healthcare support. So again, that Autism Society of America is one of our largest partners. So really trying to bring together all of these different potential talent pools and across age groups as well, because we're not just looking at entry-level talent with the neurodivergent population. Mm-hmm. There's also folks who have been in the workforce for a while who are looking for a career pivot. Yeah, across all ages and underserved, populations as well.
100%. I know you had brought up the universal design sort of context and concept. Would love to hear how that plays into something like outreach strategy. So say I go, my company has determined we would like to make sure that we're making a stronger effort to hire more neurodivergent folks. So there's an outreach strategy with that, right? Messaging matters. What are the best practices you feel like around that?
Absolutely. So in terms of the job description, or more so in terms of the hiring, branding of the company, or both?
Yeah, definitely job description for sure, a big part of that. And then also, if a recruiter is sourcing for talent and they go out and they say, okay, I'm going to go with one of the talent pools that you suggested so that we can increase our pipeline for neurodiverse talent, the messaging around when they reach out to somebody, how should that look? What are some of the considerations for that?
Right. So many times, the first entry point into your organization is from a job description. So just starting there, we internally talk about the three main components that we should think about with neuro-inclusive job descriptions: structuring, avoid cognitive overload; language, to make sure it's inclusive and, not incorporating any sense of bias; and then formatting. And when we look at, giving a sense of who your company is to a job seeker, it's so important to dive deeper into, work culture. What are the steps that your organization takes to create a more inclusive work environment? Sometimes, even terminology we've realized, like, job responsibilities or job requirements, sometimes could actually be self-eliminating for neurodivergent individuals because it puts a lot of pressure. It's like, wow, I'm required to do this. I have these responsibilities. So we approach, more, neuro-inclusive and friendly language, like how you'll make an impact or ideal skills for the job. And then accommodations is something that, we try to make as transparent and upfront as possible. And we encourage companies to do the same. So sharing, upfront, what are the accommodations your team provides? How do you integrate that into your process? So how you say it is equally as important as what you say. For example, if you're reaching out to someone, for an interview and you are trying to make sure, oftentimes neurodivergence might require that support before an interview. It can be really helpful to just mention in the email upfront saying, hey, thank you for applying for this position. We strive to create an inclusive and accessible workplace. We'd like to know if you require any accommodations to help you perform your best. For example, this could include an interpreter, arranging for a sign language interpreter, or offering a quiet space for the interview, or maybe not having your camera on, and making this a phone call, or creating a certain environment for our interview that minimizes on noise or certain factors that might cause sensory overload if it's an in-person interview. So just kind of sharing upfront that, hey, these are ways that we can support you, and integrating that into even one-on-one messages. For example, rejections can be really, really hard for neurodivergents because this is a population prone to a lot of anxiety. So how can, in the message that you send, try to share feedback, why you might not have been selected, try to indicate, well, it was not because of skills, it was because of your relocation ability, or, very specifically allowing the individual to not necessarily, self-deprecate or go into anxiety loops for, trying to figure out what went wrong in the process, but kind of really just have that clear and transparent communication and setting sort of those expectations up front for what can be provided through accommodations. So yeah, there's, little things like this we can do, both from, posting our jobs out into the world to actually conducting interviews, going back and forth with job seekers through messaging to make sure that it's really just accommodating of everyone's needs.
Yeah, it's exactly what you said, accommodating of everyone's needs. And I think when I was doing recruiting, one of the most important things that I found is that you really need to be consistent and offer this to every single candidate, whether you find someone on a platform that is intended for neurodivergent individuals, or if you find them on LinkedIn, or you find them on GitHub, or you find them just somewhere else in the interwebs. It's really important to offer all of these things to everybody because a lot of, especially neurodivergence, is invisible. And so offering those accommodations to everybody will help make your process more inclusive. And you should never make assumptions that someone does or does not need or will request those types of accommodations for the interview. So it's really important to offer those to every single person.
Exactly. And it's also like providing a forum for that. So sometimes, in the interview before it starts, just saying, hey, is there anything I should be aware of? Because especially, for interviews, I know when we chatted last, you talked about, when interviews are back to back, having even just 15-minute breaks in between calls. And there's, for individuals with different learning abilities and processing speeds, offering that like extra time, or offering a platform for someone to say, well, I might take a few moments to respond. I'm just processing information in my head. Or, hey, I might not provide eye contact, or I might have speech challenges or impediments, or I might require assistive technology in order to communicate or internalize and process information. Like kind of just, creating that forum in the beginning to just share that openly, I think can just really help reduce bias. And it's funny because you would think that in asking for these accommodations, it might increase the bias. But really, we've realized and witnessed and through data have seen that, interviewers are much more likely to be less biased because they actually understand that individual faces neurocognitive differences and are more likely to accommodate that when they're aware versus kind of making an assumption and not really knowing.
Absolutely. For myself, I identify as neurodivergent. I have ADHD, which I didn't really find out until very recently, within the last couple of years. And all of these things kind of started to fall into place and make sense to me. But one thing that I do when I'm doing an interview, when I'm interviewing at a company, is I will, a little bit different now, right? Because a lot of interviews have been virtual. So it's not as obvious certain things that you're doing while you're interviewing. But I would always ask the interviewers, is it okay? And maybe I should have been more assertive and not asked if it's okay, but just done it or let them know. But I would tell them I need to write the question down because it helps me process better. And because I get really distracted and I'll get kind of going on tangents or off topic, and then I don't set myself up for success. And interviewers have always been like, yes, absolutely. Please write the question down, write your notes down, collect yourself before. So I do think that a lot of people are inclusive, and sometimes being able to advocate for yourself is a good way to set yourself up for success. And that's why companies should have training for interviewers on how to best accommodate everybody.
Yeah. Training is such a huge part. It's like, yes, you can have the tools in place, but if you don't have the education on like how to use the tools and why the tool was built in the way that it is, then chances are you're not going to really, follow through with the end to end and know like the why behind why you're doing it. So yes, education, awareness is like key to empathy and understanding.
For sure. This is a more like pointed kind of specific question. Are there any specific questions to ask or questions to avoid when you're interviewing somebody?
Yeah. It's so interesting because a lot of times with this population, myself included, as a neurodivergent myself, and thank you for sharing, Shannon, having, questions that are like really, clear, explicit, having goals in place even, this is the expectation that I have from this question or from this interview can be really, really helpful because questions like, and you might have heard this before, tell me about yourself at the very beginning of a call, neurodivergents might say, okay, what exactly do you want to know? Or might, get a little bit flustered and that might impede performance in the interview, for example. So we always encourage, try to be, as straightforward and direct as possible with your question or what you're trying to get out of, the question. And that can be super helpful. The other in interviews is trying to provide sometimes, and this is something that's debated online a bit, is, sometimes folks might ask for interview questions ahead of the interview. And, what we always say is it's totally dependent on the individual. If the individual would prefer to have that, they can ask at that point where you in the email, offer accommodations, but not letting that, be, stand in the way of potentially introducing bias into the interview. So, having that ask up front can be helpful. Other questions I would say to ask. So oftentimes when neurodivergents, might share during the call, I am neurodivergent. Sometimes recruiters might not know, how do I even respond to that? What do I say? Because, some words are taboo, some are not. How do I really, is it appropriate for me to go deeper? And I think, what we recommend there is really asking, just thanking the individual for sharing and then asking, is there any way I can support you? And also, are there any strengths that, you have, as a neurodivergent that you believe can really, help you at work or in life. Because so many times, even the term like disabilities, or, when individuals actually have disabilities, it can be so impeding to life and debilitating. However, the key is to understand that because of those unique life experiences, it also serves as an asset. There's also like a unique perspective that individual brings, or a unique way that the individual's brain might operate that, might be something that you would never have found out if you didn't ask, or might like serve as a huge asset to the job that, might be like intensely much, potentially even more exceptional than an average candidate for the role. So kind of balancing it with both, like, I understand that might introduce challenges. Can I support you with those challenges? And then also, what are the strengths? It's sort of a very like balanced approach to take to understand the individual holistically.
Yes, I love that. It's kind of thinking about two things. So when we were doing the intro, I asked kind of more specifically, so the difference between asking, tell me about yourself, and like, can you tell us about your role in the organization's mission, and kind of decreasing the scope so that it's a little bit easier to answer. And I know that when we chatted before we recorded the podcast, I had asked if you were interested in having the questions beforehand or not. Some people say, no, I'm good. Some people really like that helps them prepare better. So just acknowledging that people have different learning styles and capabilities, and just really being able to set someone up for success, I think is a really important factor that can be applied to that interviewing capacity.
Yep, totally.
So we've talked a little bit about sourcing. We've talked a little bit about interviewing. Is there more to this than just the hiring element? And you talked a little bit about accommodations in the interview process, but what else is really needed to set neurodivergent individuals up for success? Thinking about accommodation processes before going like full throttle on sourcing and hiring, to ensure you have the proper infrastructure internally once someone onboards. What are some of the considerations there?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as a startup are building our own team, it's something that we're like figuring out and learning about every day, and then implementing in organizations as well. So I would say when an individual onboards onto the team, first of all, it's really helpful to set up a precedent of, creating that forum for whether it's with the manager in one-on-ones, or even introducing oneself to the team and sharing one's neurodivergence if comfortable can be, really helpful to get started on the job and introduce a potential conversation topic in the future with other teammates. So that's demonstrated as something that's helpful. Other ways that individuals can be set up for success is during that onboarding process. It's also helpful to, have a survey that we like to provide our employees, asking, what are certain factors that might make you uncomfortable in the workplace? What are certain ways of working that, are conducive to your success? So, for example, some teammates really benefit from heads down time. And so into our team culture, we've built a way for our notification on Slack to be heads down time, which is only interrupt for emergencies, for example. And that's sort of built into the day-to-day schedule. And that can, if truly implemented, can really increase the productivity of the individual if, focusing on one task at length. Other things, physical accommodations can also be extremely helpful. So asking up front, are there any assistive technologies that could be useful? Any sort of, ergonomic for some folks who might have challenges with physical disabilities, anything that could be helpful there. So kind of creating a survey or some sort of way to gather feedback from your teammates as soon as they join. So it's not something that has to be brought up later on in the job awkwardly through a conversation. It's like, why didn't you tell me this before? I would have, made this adjustment, especially because 65% of all accommodations are actually free. So there's zero cost to them, which means that a lot of times those are more focused on interpersonal accommodations or behavioral accommodations, like, providing, as we said, like written, instructions ahead of time, or meeting agendas, or, helping with time management, tools that can really augment one's productivity, as well as, even providing a support ecosystem for the individual to succeed, whether that's an ERG or, access to a mentor, or more so paid would be, access to therapy. Some companies I've seen provide access to tools like Headspace, things that really can allow individuals to just create an environment that allows them to bring their full selves to work, be balanced, be productive, and of course, not be burnt out over time, because sustainability is key to retention. And that's really what we try to encourage with these accommodation processes.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that stat is so interesting. 60% of accommodations are free. I've never heard that, but I hope that if folks are listening and they're trying to communicate with their leadership or their recruiting leadership or their company leadership, just really encouraging them to look beyond what they think they know, and because a lot of it is interpersonal, like you said. That was an enlightening thing for me to know, so I appreciate you sharing that. Awesome. Well, kind of in light of all of this, I'm curious, in the scope of the work you do, like, what does hiring excellence mean to you? What does it look like?
Hiring excellence, I think that is referring to like every human being in your organization being like fully tapped into, and like their talent being fully realized. The term that we talk about is like, yes, there's unemployment, there's also underemployment. And what does underemployment really feel like? And I think that is like, it's so challenging to wake up every morning and to go into a workplace that, you don't feel fully understood. You feel as though you can't bring your authentic self to work, especially because I think for individuals over the age of 25, they spend like 70 to 80% of their life at their workplace, whether that's virtual or in person. But that's like a huge amount of time. And if you're, going into work with people that, don't truly understand who you are or what your differences are or respect that, then that can just be very draining. And it can also, we've seen, and it's been demonstrated, can cause a lot of mental health challenges because, that's your day to day. So how can we, avoid that? And as we said, like make it, conducive and sustainable to everyone. And I think by changing your environment physically, if you don't like, being in dark places with no sunlight, or you can't be in cubicles, or you can't deal with fluorescent lighting or generator sounds, or, food being around in the environment, like all of that can contribute to productivity. So on an environmental perspective, on an interpersonal perspective, having your teammates and the people you surround yourself by, being aware of your challenges, being aware of your strengths, respecting them and empathizing with them and empowering you to be your best version of yourself is a second. And I think if brought together and done really well, and then of course the mission of the company aligns with your inner purpose, like I think that can really allow every individual to come into work and feel that sense of fulfillment and empowerment, and really, increase the company's innovation, productivity, bottom line, all of the good things because of it.
Amazing. Okay, so I think we are coming up on our time. Where should people go to learn more about you and more about Mentra?
Yeah, we are on www.mentra.com. We just bought the URL, so we're excited about that. And yeah, you can find us on LinkedIn at Mentra Team, myself on LinkedIn as well, Jhillika Kumar. We're on Instagram, Facebook, all of the socials as well. I think the best way to contact us is, go on our website, learn more about what we're building, what we're doing. And if you're looking to hire and foster neurodivergent talent and looking for talent pools, like we'd be more than happy to help. So we're excited to really partner with companies on their roadmaps towards neuroinclusion.
Amazing. I hope that companies reach out because it's a really important area to do better on. And I know that you all would do great work with them. Well, Jhillika, thanks again for joining us on Offer Accepted. I really appreciate you spending some time with us today. Thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Offer Accepted, the podcast for ambitious recruiting professionals, brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting platform. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow and share with your TA community. We'll see you next time.